And finally, we come to the second part of the conclusions. We will be going through the things that we saw in the course and briefly summarizing and saying some concluding words about the different Wi-Fi security schemes that we saw. So let's take a look at what we saw in the course. Open authentication is doing nothing for authentication. Then there's the infamous WEP, and that can be used both for authentication and ciphering. Typically, they would be used together. So if you're using WEP for authentication, you would also use it for ciphering. Where ciphering is encryption to encrypt the data that's being transmitted. There's non-standard mechanisms like MAC address filtering, where by non-standard I mean it's not specified how to do it in the 802.11 standard documents from IEEE, but it's very common that that capability exists in various access points, so you can do some kind of MAC address filtering. Generally, it's a bad idea to use it alone, and you would normally want to use it in combination with other mechanisms because it's not very secure. MAC addresses are easily spoofed. Then, because of the weaknesses of WEP, there's WPA and WPA2. The main difference in WPA2 being the introduction of AES, Advanced Encryption Standard, which is very strong. And both WPA and WPA2 have the PSK, which is the pre-shared key, and the enterprise modes. There is the infamous WEP, or wired equivalent privacy, which was perhaps ill-conceived. It was meant to be just something that's equivalent to wired privacy, because wired communications has some inherent protection because you have to be physically in contact with the wire to see the signals, unlike wireless where it's inherently a broadcast medium. However, besides the inherent weaknesses in WEP, the implementations of WEP added additional flaws. So for example, the IV is not always changing in some implementations, so that instead of having a 64-bit key, you might end up effectively having a 40-bit key, that kind of thing. And many attacks have been discovered over the years, and not just theoretically, but practical implementations have also been made widely available. So in your installation of Kali Linux, for example, you can find the tools that you need to crack WEP protected systems pretty easily. You just generally need to capture enough frames with enough different IVs, and then you just process that with aircrack-ng, and eventually aircrack-ng will find your WEP password for you. The first attacks you might do might be cases where you are within range of an access point and can capture frames that are going between an access point and a device that's within range of the access point. However, we also saw that it's possible to launch attacks against isolated WEP clients because the clients also have the shared key. So it's a shared secret. So client has knowledge of it, and if somehow the client can be persuaded to send frames with different IVs, then that will also be sufficient in order to crack WEP. And so we saw attacks like Cafe Latte, Herte, and so on. In these, it would induce a client to send ARP responses by sending fake ARP requests and things like that. So there are ways that you can pretend to be an access point and then get the WEP client to then be sending frames that you need in order to crack WEP. So generally, we do not recommend using WEP. In your penetration test, if you find any Wi-Fi system that is still being protected by WEP, even if it might be the 128-bit version rather than 64-bit version, don't use it. So recommend that it be stopped and something stronger be used. We saw that with WPA PSK and WPA2 PSK, every device shares the same passphrase, which derives to the same pre-shared key. So already just from general security principles, this is not a good idea. As long as just one device is compromised and the passphrase somehow can be retrieved from that device, every other device becomes compromised. And we saw that you just need to capture one four-way handshake, unlike the case of cracking WEP, where you would typically capture thousands of different frames with different IVs. You just need one four-way handshake because the approach is different. Rather than doing some kind of statistical analysis and trying to get the key that way, what happens is that the handshake is just used for verification purposes, and the cracking approach is to be looping through a word list. So there are many files that have typical passwords that people might use. So just looping through the word list and then doing brute forcing verification with this handshake. So that's why this handshake is important, because otherwise you wouldn't know if you have selected a candidate passphrase that is correct. There's no way to verify. And one other thing about this four-way handshake is that even though the full four-way handshake is 4 messages, we don't even need all the 4 messages in order to do the verification for this way of attacking WPA and WPA2, because information that you need for verification is available in subsets of the messages. So let's say like 2 or 3 of the messages should be sufficient. And we saw that with Hashcat, you can even specify rules so that you don't have to just simply use the words in a dictionary, but you can combine them, process them in certain ways, and that makes it more powerful. Of course, it slows down the attack as well. With WPA2 Enterprise, or WPA Enterprise, that's where you get the most security, and it's highly recommended for any system that truly wants to be secure to go with WPA, or especially WPA2 Enterprise mode. Because now every device has its own username and password. It does its own individual authentication. So if somehow one device is compromised, the other devices are not compromised, and it's possible, for example, then to say that, okay, access point knows which one is compromised and then stop recognizing that. You can still use the system. And then it uses EAP, which is Extensible Authentication Protocol. So with EAP, then various kinds of authentication can happen on top of it, and not all are equally strong. It is therefore highly recommended to use EAP with some mechanism with a secure tunnel for end-to-end protection. And this will be end-to-end between the network interface card and the radius server on the other side. Examples of this are PEAP, which is Protected EAP, and EAP TLS, using TLS as a secure transport layer. We also saw that WPS is not recommended because it has great weaknesses, even though modern access points try to make it harder to do something about that.